A cry in the dark. The city of Westwood had a pulse, slow, irregular, and sickly, like a heart on the verge of failing. At night, its breath came in the form of distant sirens, muffled shouts, and the occasional pop of something that could be either fireworks or gunfire. Officer Daniel Carter knew these streets too well. 15 years in law enforcement had given him an intimate understanding of the city's rot. It was in the flickering streetlights that never got fixed, the boarded-up storefronts no one bothered to reopen, and the empty houses that had long stopped being homes. Tonight, he felt it stronger than ever, the quiet wrongness in the air. His gut told him something was off. It wasn't just another slow night on patrol. It was something else, something unseen but creeping closer. He turned down Sycamore Avenue, the patrol car's headlights slicing through the fog hanging over the cracked asphalt. The radio crackled to life. "Dispatch to Unit 17. We got a disturbance reported at." Static. Then silence. Daniel frowned. His fingers hovered over the radio before deciding against it. The disturbance call was a few blocks away. Probably just another drunk outside Manny's bar, or a neighbor dispute over something meaningless. The city had no shortage of either. Then he heard it. A sound that didn't belong in the night. At first, it was almost drowned out by the wind. A faint, fragile cry. Barely more than a whisper. If his windows had been rolled up, he would have missed it entirely. His grip tightened on the wheel. His first thought was a stray cat. It wouldn't be the first time. The city was full of them, scrawny and desperate, slipping through alleys like ghosts. But something about this cry was different. It was too human. His instincts flared. He slowed the cruiser, rolling down the window. The air hit him, sharp, cold, and carrying the unmistakable scent of rain-soaked concrete, old oil, and something else. Something foul. Another cry. He turned the wheel sharply, easing the car into a narrow alley between an abandoned laundromat and a liquor store. The liquor store's neon sign buzzed erratically, its faded red glow making the shadows look deeper, darker. The alley smelled like decay, rotting food, damp cardboard, and something metallic underneath it all. Daniel killed the engine and reached for his flashlight. Stepping out of the cruiser, his boots crunched on shattered glass. The alley was filled with trash bags, discarded furniture, and forgotten things no one cared about anymore. The city's graveyard for everything useless and broken. The crying had weakened. His heartbeat quickened. He followed the sound, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating broken bottles and rats scurrying into the shadows. He approached a rusted dumpster, its lid slightly ajar. The smell hit him first. Rotting garbage, urine, and something worse, something that made his stomach turn. Then he saw them. Two impossibly small feet, pale as moonlight, sticking out from beneath a torn garbage bag. His breath hitched. Daniel moved on instinct, pushing the lid open, his hands trembling. The flashlight's beam swept over the contents, mounds of trash, torn rags, old newspapers. And there, barely visible under the filth, were two newborns. His world tilted. Tiny bodies, motionless at first, wrapped in a thin, blood-stained towel. One of them let out a weak whimper, a sound so fragile it barely registered. The other was eerily silent. His pulse roared in his ears. "No, no, no," he muttered, shoving the trash aside, reaching in. His fingers brushed against cold, clammy skin. They were still alive. Barely. One of the twins, Daniel couldn't tell if it was a boy or girl, was struggling to breathe, its tiny chest rising and falling in erratic gasps. The other lay limp, unmoving. Panic surged through him, but training kicked in. He pulled them both close, shielding them from the biting wind. They were impossibly small, barely the length of his forearm. The blood on the towel had dried, crusted over, and he had no idea how long they had been here. His radio crackled. "Unit 17, come in. Unit 17, do you copy?" Daniel fumbled for the radio with one hand while holding the twins close. "Dispatch." His voice came out rough, his throat tight. "I need EMS at Sycamore and 4th. Now." "Copy that. Unit 17. What's the situation?" "I've got 2 abandoned infants, newborns, still breathing, but barely." A pause. Then the dispatcher's voice softened. "Help is on the way." Daniel looked down at the twins. The wind howled through the alley, but all he could hear was the fragile sound of their breathing. His grip tightened around them. No one had left them here by accident. Someone had thrown them away, and whoever had done it had wanted them to die. But they hadn't. Not yet. And as long as he was breathing, Daniel Carter wasn't going to let them slip away. He just didn't know that this night, the night he found them, was only the beginning of something much, much bigger. Something that would change everything. Forever. The twins who weren't meant to survive. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they cut through the night. Daniel Carter didn't move. He stood in the alley, his arms wrapped around the fragile bodies of the newborn twins, shielding them from the cold. His heart pounded as he tried to process what he had just found. The weight of them, so impossibly small, felt like a terrible burden in his hands. The baby in his left arm whimpered, its tiny mouth opening and closing weakly, as if searching for something it would never find. The other was terrifyingly still. Daniel pressed his fingers against the child's neck, searching for a pulse. Faint, weak, but still there. They were alive. He held them tighter. "Come on, just hang in there," he murmured, his voice raw. The wind howled down the alleyway, whipping against his uniform. He barely noticed. His mind was racing. Who could do this? Who could take 2 newborns, wrap them in a bloody towel, and throw them away like garbage? The thought sickened him. A car screeched to a stop at the mouth of the alley, its headlights flooding the scene with blinding light. The paramedics jumped out. 2 of them. A tall woman with sharp eyes and a younger man who looked barely out of training, rushed forward with an urgency Daniel had rarely seen. They knew. They could feel it too. "What do we got?" the woman asked, already reaching for the twins. Daniel hesitated. His arms tightened around them involuntarily. He didn't want to let go. It was ridiculous. He wasn't their father, their protector, anything but a cop on patrol who had stumbled into a nightmare. And yet he felt something deep in his gut. A promise. A duty. A boy and a girl. He finally managed. His voice came out rough. "Newborns. They were in the dumpster." The woman flinched. The younger medic swore under his breath. Daniel forced himself to let go as the paramedics carefully transferred the babies onto the stretchers. They worked quickly, checking vitals, wrapping them in warm thermal blankets. The girl, the one who had whimpered, let out a tiny breathy cry as they placed a breathing mask over her face. The boy still didn't move. Daniel's stomach twisted. "Don't die. Not after all this." The younger paramedic turned to him, his face pale. "You said you found them in the dumpster." Daniel nodded. "They weren't just abandoned," the medic muttered. "They were meant to die." Daniel knew it was true. The damp towel wrapped around them wasn't enough to keep them warm. They had been left here to freeze, suffocate, or starve, whichever came first. And yet, somehow, they had survived. The paramedics loaded the twins into the ambulance, shutting the doors with a heavy clang. Daniel swallowed hard, watching as the vehicle sped away, its sirens cutting through the night. He felt cold, colder than he had in years. The investigation begins. By the time Daniel got back to the precinct, the weight of the night pressed heavily on his shoulders. He hadn't realized how tightly he had been gripping the steering wheel until his hands ached. The station was quieter than usual. Most of the night shift officers were out on patrol, but Captain Ellis was there, waiting for him. He was an older man, his graying hair cut close to his scalp, his face hardened from years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. He looked up from his desk, his sharp eyes locking onto Daniel. "What the hell happened?" Daniel dropped into the chair across from him. "You're gonna want to sit down for this." Ellis frowned but leaned back. "Talk." Daniel told him everything. By the time he was finished, Ellis was rubbing a hand down his face. "Jesus Christ. They weren't just abandoned," Daniel said. "This wasn't some scared teenager who didn't know what to do. Someone wanted them dead." Ellis exhaled sharply. "The hospital called," he said after a moment. "The girl is stable. The boy." He hesitated. "He's hanging on, but just barely. Severe hypothermia. Malnourished. Dehydrated." Daniel clenched his fists. "Any leads?" Ellis shook his head. "None. No witnesses. No security cameras in that alley. No reports of a woman going into labor recently. No missing persons reports for newborns. Nothing." Daniel knew what that meant. Someone had erased these kids before they were even given a chance to exist. The mother nobody knew. Hours passed. Daniel couldn't sleep. He kept seeing their tiny faces, their pale skin, the way the boy hadn't moved at all. By morning, he was back at the hospital. The doctors let him in, though he wasn't sure why. Maybe because they had seen his face the night before and knew he wouldn't leave otherwise. The girl was in the NICU, wrapped in wires, her tiny chest rising and falling with each struggling breath. The boy was next to her, fighting harder than any human should have to at that age. Daniel didn't realize he had been standing there for nearly an hour until a nurse gently touched his arm. "There's someone asking about the babies," she said softly. "A woman." Daniel's pulse jumped. "Who?" The nurse hesitated. "She won't say, but she looks." She paused, searching for the right words. "Scared." Daniel followed her to the waiting area. A young woman stood near the window, arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Her hair was dark and tangled, her clothes worn, and her eyes, when she turned to look at him, held a kind of exhaustion that came from something deeper than lack of sleep. Daniel approached slowly. "I'm Officer Carter," he said. "Are you here about the twins?" She swallowed hard. Her lips trembled. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she asked, "Are they alive?" Daniel's breath caught. Everything in him sharpened. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied her hollow cheeks, the bruises on her wrists, the way her fingers trembled as she gripped the sleeves of her coat. She wasn't just scared. She was terrified. And Daniel realized, with sudden certainty, that she wasn't just here looking for information. She knew something. Or worse, she had been the one who left them behind. His voice was careful when he finally spoke. "You need to tell me everything." The woman exhaled shakily, tears welling in her eyes. Then she whispered 4 words that sent ice through his veins. They were never mine. The woman who wasn't their mother. Daniel Carter had dealt with liars before. As a cop, he could usually tell when someone was feeding him half-truths or holding back the real story. But this woman, she didn't look like she was lying. She looked broken. Her body was tense, her hands trembling as she clenched her coat tighter around herself, as if trying to disappear. The dark circles under her eyes made her look like she hadn't slept in weeks, maybe longer. But what caught Daniel the most was the way she had asked the question. "Are they alive?" Not "where are they?" Not "can I see them?" Just that. Daniel sat down across from her in the hospital waiting area, keeping his voice steady. "You said the twins weren't yours." His eyes stayed locked onto hers, watching for the tiniest reaction. "Then whose were they?" The woman inhaled sharply, but didn't answer. Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Listen, you need to tell me the truth. 2 babies were nearly left to die last night. If you know something, now is the time to talk." Her lip trembled. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "I wasn't supposed to survive either." Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" She swallowed, eyes darting toward the door as if she was debating whether to run. Then she seemed to make a decision, one that terrified her. She took a slow, shaky breath. "My name is Lillian," she said softly, "and I think they were meant to be the same as me." Daniel's stomach twisted. "Same how?" Lillian's voice was barely above a whisper. "Disposable. A sinister pattern." Daniel didn't interrupt. He let Lillian talk, and what she told him made his blood run cold. She had been born into something that wasn't quite a family, and wasn't quite a cult, but something far worse. A network. A hidden system where unwanted babies, mostly from young mothers with nowhere to turn, simply disappeared. Some were sold, some were discarded, and some were never meant to survive in the first place. Daniel clenched his fists. Lillian had barely made it out. She had been raised by people who treated her as less than human, and she had spent her entire life trying to escape. When she finally did, she went looking for others like her. Children who were being abandoned, erased. That's how she found out about the twins. She had overheard something in a shelter, a pregnant girl, barely 16, sobbing to a nurse about a deal she had been forced into. A deal where her babies were already promised to people she didn't know. She was terrified, Lillian whispered. She didn't want to give them up, but she didn't have a choice. Daniel's grip tightened on his knees. "And you think those twins were hers?" Lillian nodded. "I tried to follow her, to help. But before I could, she vanished. And then, last night, I heard a rumor." Daniel's eyes darkened. "What rumor?" "That 2 newborns were dumped in an alley." She wiped at her eyes. "I knew it was them. I came here hoping, praying, that I was wrong." Her voice cracked. "That maybe they didn't die." Daniel exhaled. "They're alive," he said. "Barely." Lillian's shoulders sagged, as if the weight of the world had just crashed down on her. She squeezed her hands together, rocking slightly. Daniel studied her carefully. Was she telling the truth? She had no reason to make up a story like this. No reason to come looking for children who weren't hers. And yet, if what she said was true, then someone out there wanted those babies dead. Not abandoned. Erased. The underground trade. Daniel felt a dark sense of urgency settling into his chest. He needed to act. Fast. If there was an organized system trafficking babies, selling them, or worse, disposing of them, then this was bigger than an abandoned alleyway case. Much bigger. He stood abruptly, pulling out his phone. Lillian flinched. "Where are you going?" she asked. Her voice panicked. Daniel looked down at her. "To find out who wanted those kids dead." He called Captain Ellis as he stormed out of the hospital. "We need to pull every missing person report for pregnant women in the last 6 months," he said the moment Ellis answered. "And I need to speak to the girl who gave birth to those twins." Ellis was silent for a moment. Then, that might be a problem. Daniel stopped in his tracks. "What?" "The hospital just called back," Ellis said grimly. "They pulled the twins' blood work." Daniel's heart pounded. "Neither of them were registered in the system," Ellis continued. "No birth records, no hospital deliveries, no DNA matches in the database." Daniel's stomach dropped. It was as if they had never existed. Just like Lillian said. A chill ran down his spine. "And the mother?" Ellis hesitated. "They found a match," he admitted. "A girl. 16. No ID. No last name." Daniel's pulse hammered. "Where is she?" Silence. "Then, they found her body 2 hours ago," Ellis said quietly. "Drowned in the river." Daniel's breath left him. Suddenly, everything was clear. Whoever had done this wasn't just cleaning up loose ends. They were covering their tracks. And now, someone knew Lillian had been asking questions. Daniel turned back toward the hospital, heart slamming against his ribs. Because if someone was tying up loose ends, Lillian might be next. The silent war. Daniel Carter had seen the worst of humanity. He had worked homicides, drug busts, missing persons cases, each one showing him just how brutal the world could be. But this was different. This wasn't just a crime. It was a system, a network of shadows, where babies vanished, mothers disappeared, and the world never noticed. And right now, Lillian was the next loose end. Nowhere is safe. Daniel gripped his phone tighter, his heartbeat a thunderstorm in his chest. They found the mother's body. He repeated, pacing outside the hospital. Captain Ellis sighed on the other end. Yeah, she washed up near the docks. No ID, no wallet, nothing. Daniel clenched his jaw. This wasn't an accident. It was a warning. Whoever's behind this, Ellis continued, lowering his voice. They're good at making people disappear. Daniel glanced back at the hospital doors. Inside, Lillian was sitting alone, staring at her hands. She had barely escaped once. She wouldn't survive twice. I need backup, Daniel said. Now. But Ellis hesitated. I don't think that's a good idea. Daniel stopped cold. Excuse me? Ellis sighed. Look, I've been digging. This thing. It's big. Bigger than you and me. The kind of thing that gets cops killed. If you push too hard, you're gonna get buried. Daniel's blood went ice cold. So what? We just let them get away with it. Ellis was silent. Daniel clenched his teeth. Fine. If the system was compromised, he'd do this himself. The shadow watching them. Daniel stormed back into the hospital, but the moment he stepped inside, his instincts screamed. Something felt off. The waiting area was still. Too still. The receptionist, who had been friendly earlier, wouldn't meet his eyes. Two men in dark suits sat near the exit, pretending to read newspapers. And then, Lillian was gone. The chair where she had been sitting was empty. Daniel's pulse slammed into overdrive. No, no, no. He scanned the room, eyes darting from face to face. Then, just as panic started to rise, he saw her. She was walking out the side door. But not alone. A man in a gray coat had his hand on her back, guiding her forward. She wasn't resisting, but something about her body language was wrong. She was stiff, unnatural, like she knew she couldn't run. Daniel didn't think. He moved. The kidnapping. He shoved past the receptionist, bolting through the side door just in time to see the man steering Lillian toward a black SUV. Hey, Daniel barked. The man froze. For a split second, he hesitated. Then he grabbed Lillian's arm tighter. Lillian gasped in pain. Daniel's hand went straight to his gun. Step away from her, he ordered. The man turned, finally facing him. And Daniel's stomach dropped. He knew this guy. Detective Alan Graves. Narcotics Division. Daniel had worked cases with him for years. And now, here he was, trying to disappear Lillian like she was just another piece of trash. What are you doing, Graves? Daniel demanded. Graves didn't answer. He just smirked. Walk away, Carter. Daniel's fingers tightened around his gun. Not happening. Lillian was shaking. Graves' grip on her wrist was too tight, his fingers digging into her skin. You don't understand what you're messing with, Graves said, his voice calm. You think you can fix this. You can't. This is bigger than a couple of dead kids. Daniel's vision blurred with rage. He didn't think. He acted. 1 second, he was staring Graves down. The next, he lunged. He grabbed Graves by the collar, wrenching him back just as the SUV's side door slid open. Another man inside reached for a gun. But Daniel was faster. Bang. A single warning shot into the ground. Try it, Daniel growled. The man hesitated. That was all Daniel needed. He swung Graves into the side of the SUV, wrenching Lillian free. Run, he ordered. Lillian didn't need to be told twice. She bolted. And Daniel. He fought. A dirty cop and a deadly secret. Daniel took Graves down hard, shoving his knee into the man's back as he tried to fight back. You're dirty, Daniel spat. How long? Graves coughed, smirking even as blood dripped from his nose. You have no idea how deep this goes, he taunted. You think I'm the only cop in on this? Daniel's grip tightened. How many? He demanded. But Graves just laughed. And that's when Daniel heard it. Tires screeching. Footsteps pounding. Lillian's scream. Daniel's head snapped up, just in time to see a second SUV speeding toward Lillian. A masked man jumped out and snatched her. Before Daniel could even react, they were gone. Lillian was gone. The hunt begins. Daniel stood there, chest heaving, fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his skin. They had her. They had Lillian. Graves was still smirking beneath him, as if he knew something Daniel didn't. Daniel resisted the urge to break his jaw. Instead, he grabbed his radio. Ellis, he barked. They took her. A sharp inhale. Where? Black SUV. No plates. Headed east. Ellis cursed. I'll get a team on it. Daniel's hands shook. He had one job. To keep her safe. And he had failed. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Daniel stood, shoving Graves into the asphalt. Then, with ice in his veins, he growled. You're going to tell me everything. Because now, it was war. The deep end. Lillian was gone. Daniel Carter had failed. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just chasing a case, he was living it. His heartbeat was a drum, pounding in his ears as the black SUV disappeared into the night. The only thing left behind was the cold silence of the alley and the smirking face of Detective Alan Graves, lying bloody beneath him. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a message. You can't save her. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Daniel wasn't going to stop. And he wasn't just going to get Lillian back. He was going to burn this entire operation to the ground. Interrogation. Daniel yanked Graves up by the collar, shoving him hard against the SUV. The man winced, his lip already split from their earlier fight. You've got one chance, Daniel growled. Where are they taking her? Graves laughed, spitting blood onto the pavement. You're in over your head, Carter. Daniel tightened his grip. You really think you can protect them? He hissed. They just tried to take you out. That guy in the car. He had a gun pointed at your head the second I pulled mine. You're not one of them. You're just another disposable piece. Graves' smirk faltered, just for a second. But then, like a switch flipping, it was back. You think this is about me? Graves taunted. This is bigger than some crooked cop covering his tracks. You're standing in the middle of something you don't understand. And trust me, you don't want to. Daniel pulled his gun and pressed it under Graves' chin. Oh, I do, he said darkly. So start talking. Graves exhaled, tilting his head just slightly. Or what? He mused. You'll kill me. Right here. In front of all these cameras. Daniel hesitated. And that's when he saw them. Tiny, blinking red lights. Security cameras. They were being watched. That meant one thing. Whoever was pulling the strings already knew what happened. And they were prepared. Daniel lowered his gun, stepping back. Graves chuckled. That's what I thought. But Daniel wasn't done. He reached into Graves' pocket, yanking out his phone. And then, before Graves could react, he slammed it against the pavement. The screen shattered, sparks flickering from the exposed circuits. Graves' smirk vanished. Daniel knew exactly what that phone was. A direct line to whoever was running this operation. And now, they had no way to warn them. Daniel grabbed his radio. Ellis, I need you at my location now. No. Daniel froze. Ellis' voice was low, shaky, like he was being watched. There's nothing I can do, Carter. Daniel's stomach dropped. Ellis was compromised. The setup. Daniel had two options. Go after Lillian alone and risk walking into a trap. take Graves somewhere off the grid and force the truth out of him. He didn't have time for the second option. Lillian was running out of time. He ran to his car, throwing open the door. But as he reached for the ignition, his phone buzzed. Unknown number. His pulse spiked. He answered. Carter. A voice rasped, distorted, scrambled, like it had been run through a voice modulator. If you want to see the girl alive, stop chasing shadows. Daniel's knuckles went white. Where is she? He demanded. A pause. You'll find her when we're done with her. Then, click. Daniel slammed his fist against the dashboard. They weren't planning to keep her alive. He threw the car into drive. Lillian's nightmare. Somewhere in the darkness, Lillian woke up screaming. A hand clamped over her mouth. She froze. A man stood over her, face hidden, masked. We're going to have a little chat, he murmured. Her body trembled, but she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just stared, because deep down she knew. If she wanted to survive, she had to play their game. The clock is ticking. Daniel had one chance, one lead, one last shot at saving her before she disappeared forever. But he wasn't just fighting the kidnappers. He was fighting the entire system. And if he lost, Lillian wouldn't be the only one who vanished. He would too. The point of no return. Time was against him. Daniel Carter gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The city blurred past in streaks of neon and shadow as he raced through the streets, the echoes of that distorted voice still ringing in his ears. You'll find her when we're done with her. His mind spiraled. Who were they? What did they want? And most importantly, why take Lillian? Nothing about this felt random. Lillian wasn't just collateral damage. She was the target. And Daniel was starting to realize that this case wasn't about some underground ring or a corrupt cop. This was personal. Ellis betrayal. Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time, the caller ID made his stomach drop. Detective Ellis. The man who had just told him, "There's nothing I can do." Daniel hesitated, his pulse a war drum in his chest. Then slowly he answered. Ellis. Static crackled on the other end. Then, "You need to back off, Carter." Daniel nearly slammed the brakes. His partner, his best friend, sounded different. Not nervous, not scared, but resigned. "You're in way over your head," Ellis continued. "You don't know who you're up against." Daniel clenched his jaw. "You're working for them." Silence. Then a sigh. "It's not that simple." "Then make it simple," Daniel snapped. "They took Lillian. I'm not backing down." "Then you're going to get yourself killed," Ellis said quietly. Daniel's vision darkened at the edges. This wasn't happening. Not Ellis. Not the man who had saved his life more times than he could count. But before Daniel could respond, Ellis spoke again. This time, barely a whisper. "They're watching me, Carter. They're watching you. This isn't just about Lillian." A pause. "It's about what she found." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Ellis inhaled sharply. "She's not just a journalist, Carter. She was investigating something big, something that got her on their radar." Daniel gripped the wheel, his mind racing. What did she find? Static crackled. Then, check her apartment. Click. The call ended. The hunt for answers. Daniel's gut screamed trap. But he didn't have a choice. Lillian had always been more than just a crime reporter. She was relentless. If she had uncovered something dangerous, something worth killing over, it meant her kidnapping wasn't just a warning. It was a cover-up. Daniel floored the gas pedal. Lillian's fight. Somewhere in the darkness, Lillian waited. Her hands were bound. Her head throbbed from whatever they had drugged her with. But her mind was clear. And she knew one thing. She couldn't wait for Daniel to save her. She had to save herself. The man in the mask had left her alone, but not before whispering something that made her skin crawl. We just need to know what you told him. So that was it. They weren't just going to kill her. They were going to break her first. Lillian exhaled slowly, pushing down the fear curling in her chest. She had been in dangerous situations before. Never like this, but danger was danger. And every predator had a weakness. She just had to find theirs. The break-in. Daniel didn't use the front door. He scaled the fire escape, breaking in through Lillian's second-story window. The apartment was eerily silent, the air thick with something wrong. The moment he stepped inside, he knew. Someone had been here before him. Papers were scattered, drawers ripped open. Someone had torn the place apart, looking for something. Daniel moved quickly, scanning the room. What had she found? Then his eyes landed on her desk. A laptop. He rushed over, flipping it open. The screen flickered to life, and a single document was left open. The Enclave. Daniel's stomach clenched. The name meant nothing to him, but whatever it was, someone was willing to kill over it. Suddenly, something shifted behind him. A shadow. Daniel barely had time to react before a figure lunged from the darkness. Gun in hand. The truth is a loaded gun. Daniel twisted, dodging the first blow. The second nearly caught his ribs, but he countered, slamming the attacker against the desk. The laptop crashed to the floor. A struggle. Grunts. Heavy breathing. A gun skidding across the wooden floor. Daniel moved on instinct, reaching for his own weapon. But the attacker was faster. The cold barrel pressed against his temple. Should have backed off, Carter. A familiar voice. Daniel's heart stopped. Ellis. His best friend had just put a gun to his head. A bullet between betrayal and redemption. Daniel Carter had faced death before. Gunfights, high-speed chases, a knife to the ribs in a dark alley when he was just a rookie. But none of that compared to the cold betrayal of a best friend. Ellis' gun pressed against his temple, the barrel digging into his skin. The weight of it wasn't just metal. It was years of trust, loyalty, and brotherhood, turned into a weapon. Daniel's breathing slowed. His mind sharpened. He only had one shot at surviving this. Ellis, he said, his voice steady. I don't believe you want to do this. His former partner's grip on the gun didn't waver. But his eyes, they flickered. Doubt. Regret. And that was all Daniel needed. A fight with no winners. Daniel moved first. A sharp twist, his palm slamming Ellis' wrist away from his head. The gun fired. A deafening blast in the small apartment, shattering a lamp instead of his skull. Then, chaos. Fists collided. Bodies crashed against furniture. The air filled with grunts and curses as the two men, once brothers, fought like animals. Ellis was stronger, but Daniel was angrier. And anger had a way of making a man relentless. They struggled for control of the gun, the metal slipping between their fingers. Then, a final, desperate move. Daniel grabbed a bookend from Lillian's desk and swung. It connected. Ellis crumpled. Not unconscious, not dead, but stunned long enough for Daniel to grab the gun and stagger back, panting. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Ellis, still on the floor, chuckled bitterly. You should have run, Carter. Daniel clenched the weapon. And you should have remembered who you were before you sold your soul. Ellis' smile faded. I didn't sell it. I had no choice. Daniel's jaw tightened. Make me believe that. The truth about the Enclave. Ellis sat up slowly, rubbing the blood trickling down his temple. Then he sighed. It's not what you think, he muttered. The Enclave isn't some underground gang or a hit squad. It's bigger. Daniel didn't lower the gun. How big? Ellis exhaled, his shoulders sagging under some invisible weight. They own judges, cops, politicians, hell, even journalists. His eyes flickered toward the shattered remains of Lillian's desk. That's why they took her. She found something they didn't want the world to know. Daniel's heart pounded. What did she find? Ellis hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "A kill list." Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him. The hit list. Ellis continued. Names. People who were supposed to disappear. Whistleblowers, investigators, anyone who got too close to the truth. And Lillian. He swallowed hard. Lillian's name was on it. Silence. Daniel felt his pulse slow. Freeze. Lillian wasn't just in danger. She was marked for death. Lillian's escape. Somewhere in a cold, dark room, Lillian Harper knew her time was running out. Her captors weren't in a hurry. They didn't need to be. She was bound, trapped, and alone. But she was not defeated. The man in the mask had come back, circling her like a wolf, his voice smooth and patient. "Where's the backup file, Ms. Harper?" Lillian didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about." A chuckle. A slow, deliberate step closer. "You're a terrible liar." She braced herself, expecting a blow. But instead, the masked man just leaned in. "We already tore through your apartment," he murmured. "And we know you don't work alone. The question is, who else knows?" Lillian's blood turned to ice. They weren't just looking for the file. They were looking for Daniel. Her mind raced. She needed to get out. Now, her hands were bound, but not impossibly so. And these idiots had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated her. Lillian had spent her entire career exposing criminals. She knew how to fight back. She just needed the right moment. And when the masked man turned his back to take a phone call, she found it. Using all her strength, she jerked her wrists apart. The zip ties snapped. Lillian lunged, grabbing a loose metal chair, and swung. The masked man went down hard. Alarms blared. Footsteps pounded outside the door. Lillian didn't hesitate. She ran. A desperate call. Daniel's phone buzzed. Unknown number. His gut twisted. He answered. Static. Then, a voice. Daniel. His breath caught. Lillian. She was alive. But her voice was urgent, breathless. Running. "They're coming for you, Daniel." His stomach dropped. Lillian wasn't warning him about her own danger. She was warning him about what was coming next. A shadow moved outside the window. A figure. Then, gunfire. The glass exploded. Daniel hit the floor. And the last thing he heard before the line went dead was Lillian screaming.